Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, Kids Independent Media Production. Today we are continuing with our Decades series, finally getting to the one I've been most excited about, the 60s. Development of rock and roll, leveling up of rock and roll as we know it becoming the popular music. As with the previous decades that we've gone through, the music gives context for what the instruments that we're using to make it back then need to sound like, different directions that the tuning is going, and particularly with the drums, but also with everything else. We're starting to hear distorted guitars, we're starting to hear overdriven things, we're starting to experience recordings that are multi-tracked, layered, more experimental, and this is the beginning of the recording studio as an instrument coming into play with popular music. In terms of drum sounds overall, we are looking again at more experimentation, more new ideas, more what if we try this, what's that going to do? Because things in this style of music, this overarching style of music that we call rock and roll, were not codified in any particular ways just yet. There was still a lot of room to grow and a lot of opportunity to discover something brand new, just with a little bit of change. For me, when I think of 60s sounds, I imagine a couple of different sounds, or sort of two big arenas to think in. One is the muffled arena, and the other is the wide open kind of tuning arena. And today, we're going to touch on both, starting with the muffled variety. Because of the sound of the music, because of multi-tracking and layering and things, the desired sound ultimately of the drums in the mix was starting to move and change, and lots of popular bands, the Beatles obviously, but many others as well, were starting to hear shorter, punchier, kind of, for lack of a better phrase, we don't really love this phrase, but cutting through the mix kind of sounds, because there was a lot more stuff going on top of the drums now. It wasn't just 3 or 4 people playing live in a room and calling it a day. Today we're using some of the same drums that we used in the 50s episode, the toms and the bass drum, though the tuning scheme and the setup is different. And we've also procured a 60s Ludwig snare drum to go with this to just get us all the way into the energy of that time frame. In addition to the old snare drum, which we did choose because it is wood, and since we're sort of thinking about these Beatles sounds, we wanted to get as close to a jazz fest as we could. We're using my Precision Drum Company toms, which are 12 and 14, and we're using my 60s Gretsch bass drum, which is a 20, which is getting us into the right kind of sizes, the right kind of sound for this stuff. Let's hear some from the muffled version of this setup. Now, the idea here with muffling them in this manner, and depending on who you talk to, especially if you're getting into Beatlemaniacs, it could be tea towels, it could be packs of cigarettes. They did a lot of different things over the course of time of recording. The main thing that we're looking for here is shortening of the overall tone, boosting the fundamental, suppressing the overtones. We want shorter sounds, warmer sounds, things where you hear the rhythm really clearly and it's not taking up a lot of space with sustain. Additionally, for the bass drum, you may have noticed we've removed the front head. What this is giving us is actually threefold. Thing one is, without a reso, sustain drops to nearly nothing, even if we didn't have muffling inside of the drum. Thing two is, we can manipulate muffling inside of the drum really easily without having to remove heads or cut holes in heads or anything like that. Today we're using a blanket inside to help focus the tone of the beater and get rid of any kind of harsh overtones that might exist inside of the drum. And finally, this allows us to also manipulate the location of the microphone really easily. So if we want to get closer to the beater for one sound or move away from there, have it off axis, very easy to look at it, hear how it sounds, make adjustments, and decide on the ultimate sound of the bass drum. Additionally, you may notice that there's a felt strip inside of the drum. This is known as a Pratt muffler, and Gretsch drums from this era had them built in with a knob on top of the bass drum to adjust the tension. Currently, I don't have tension on that, so it's not really affecting the sound of the drum very much, but given that there's a blanket in there, even if it was dialed in, it wouldn't change things. Let's hear a little more from the very muffled setup. In terms of the tuning of the rest of the kit, everything is fairly middle of the road. The heads on the toms are basically the same pitch, top and bottom. The snare is not particularly tight, and I'm taking great pains to make sure that I'm not catching the rim when I strike backbeats on the snare drum, and that I'm not hitting the toms terribly hard, because when they're muffled like this, they can get choked out if you really dig into them, and hitting rim shots on the snare it sounds not like the sound that we're looking for. Now, moving dramatically in the other direction, we also had drummers in this era who were coming into rock and roll from a jazz kind of background, and they were hearing wide open sounds, louder sounds, more kind of just generally a lot more drum in the drum sound. Mitch Mitchell's one of my favorites. There are lots of people that I could name, but for sure, what we're looking at here now is keeping the punchy bass drum, but allowing everything else to be wide open in a little bit more of a big band kind of way. What this means for us is pitching the toms up a little bit overall, tuning them, to taste a little bit, but generally they're not low and flappy and they're not singing for a super long time. They still have articulation, and when we hit them hard or soft, they're speaking at all of those dynamics. Additionally, for the snare drum, because we're going to be playing rim shots, we are tuning it up a fair bit. We're tightening the wires a little bit, not to the point of choking, but to the point of articulation and clarity at all of the dynamics. And then lastly, we can play faster, sharper, more aggressive ideas on these drums because there is a lot more attack in them. The sound of the quiet hits and the sound of the loud hits is much more dramatic in a drum that doesn't have any muffling at all. Something definitely worth noting, especially with this particular decade, which is an extremely experimental decade where a lot of music came out and a lot of bands released a lot of records, like single bands. It's worth noting that they didn't always go for the same sound on every record. Ringo is a perfect example of this. A lot of us listen to Abbey Road or Come Together specifically and think that's the Ringo sound. but he sounded different on every record, and it didn't matter so much what room he was in. He was making choices as well. There were muffling choices, different drums used, different dynamics in play, hitting hard sometimes, hitting soft sometimes. All of these players, and I mean, even, toward the end of the decade, we've got John Bonham coming out and bringing in a whole other thing on top of all of that, which was wide open, but then huge drums. At the end of the day, people were doing whatever they wanted and also whatever they had to get the sound in the end that they wanted to hear in the music that they were making. And that's why this decade is still so influential, and why you can hear so many bands even today referencing this music with the sounds and the production and post-production that you're choosing. It's super seminal, and it's never going away. Now, a word on cymbals. The 60s was the time frame where people started to think of rock cymbals and jazz cymbals, and you may have seen old cymbals that were starting to have stamps on them, haphazard ink stamps that said things like hi-hat, or that said things like ride on them, things of that nature. The one thing that we know for sure is that a lot of beautiful, thin, smoky, jazzy cymbals were killed off at the advent of rock and roll, because this music was really aggressive, really loud, and people were competing with larger amplifiers in bigger rooms where maybe the overheads, well, maybe there were no overheads on the drum set. Maybe it was minimally mic'd, or the drums weren't mic'd at all. This means that there were starting to be changes about what cymbal companies were thinking of in terms of what they needed to make, because the market out there was telling them that the music was getting louder. And as we get into the next couple of decades, you're going to see that the evolution of style-specific cymbals started to be a huge deal, because people had specific things they needed as this music developed. As far as the cymbals that we chose today, we basically just went into our bag and picked ones that give us the sort of sound that we hear on recordings from this time period. Our old A copy that Jesse Simpson made. We have the old K top copy that Jesse also made. That's a copy of my old K top. And then a straight up Zildjian new beat bottom, because these together, when I'm playing them, they make me want to play Beatles kind of vibes, and they also make me think of those Hendrix sounds and other kind of heavier rock things from that time period. One thing that we painfully neglected to mention in the 50s decade episode is that the 50s is when the synthetic drumhead came into existence as a thing that you could purchase. It had only been natural hide heads before that. The 60s is when synthetic drum heads were essentially the norm. You'd see them all over, and that's another big part of the normal sound of rock and roll, because they could handle the punishment that people were doling out to them. They were affordable, they were disposable, essentially, and it really influenced the way that people played, because they felt different, the sound was different, the tuning range was different, and then they stayed in tune once you put them where you wanted them, rather than being susceptible to the weather and everything else. All right, that about wraps it up for the 60s. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you hear about all of our new videos. Please step over to the Patreon and check out all the layers over there. We have a lot of options and a lot of extra content, anecdotes, other playing footage, all kinds of great stuff over there. I personally would love to know what your favorite 60s drum sound is, because we're always trying to figure out what they were using, how they were tuning, all those sorts of things, and there was so much music in that time, it's hard for any of us to know about even half of it. So if you've got a favorite, a player, a record, a year, let us know.